Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Good evening to our distinguished guests, the friends of the MISTRA family, our colleagues at MISTRA, and to Mali, you may all sit down. My name is Xolelwa Kadia. I'm the head of consultancy services at the Mapungubwe Institute for Strategic Reflection, MISTRA. I am your program coordinator today, and it is such an honor for me to be standing here. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all our distinguished guests. We have with us the former President of the Republic, Mr. Thabo Mbeki. We also, I'd like to recognize the Vice Chancellor of this institution, Professor Montli. And we also have members of the diplomatic community that are with us today. And I'd also like to recognize the board of directors of MISTRA and also all the contributors to the book that we're launching today. For those who are familiar with MISTRA's work or who have been following our work, you would know that usually we would have a conference when we launch our priority research projects. However, tonight we decided to follow a different format in launching this book on the Great Recession. We decided that it will be a book launch, and it's an evening event, so it will be a very short program. I will promise you that. And I'd like then to also make some remarks on the program. There has been some minor adjustments. I know when you received the invitation, some of you read that we will be getting the keynote remarks from the former president. However, we've had to change that. He is with us tonight, and he is here as a contributor to the book. So he will participate in the end during the Q&A with the contributors. In his stead, we have asked Dr. Raj Davidian to make some remarks on the book. On that note, we will then begin with our program. And I would like to call on Professor Mandla Makanya, who is the main host, to make some opening and welcome remarks.
Thank you so much, Program Director, Ms. Xolelwa Kadia. Just to greet President Thabo Mbeki, who is the former president of our country, but also the patron of Timali, the chairperson of the board of MISTRA, Professor Sibusiso Velkomo, the executive director of MISTRA, Mr. Joel Nechistenze, and also the members of the board, our former ministers and deputy ministers, and all those who are important guests this evening that is inclusive of the authors of various chapters of this book. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very warm good evening to you all. And welcome to this exciting and long-awaited Great Recession book launch. If memory serves me well, the Great Recession, which is the subject of this report, had its genesis in late 2007 with the subprime and property bubble debacle in the United States, and lasted officially until mid-2009. In the intervening period and for some time thereafter, it is estimated that the US Federal Reserve bailed out central banks by lowering interest rates to virtually zero and pumping an estimated $7.7 trillion into emergency loans to shore up failing institutions and a failing economy. This picture only tells one side of the story. The human toll of the Great Recession was massive. The United States alone shed more than 7.5 million jobs, causing its unemployment rate to double. American households lost roughly $16 trillion of net worth as a result of the stock market plunge. People lost their incomes, their homes, their savings, and their livelihoods in vast numbers. Given the centrality of the American economy in the global arena, the Great Recession found its echoes across the world. Economies of countries such as Greece, Mexico, Argentina, and a host of others suffered catastrophic collapses, often accompanied by civil unrest. Some of these countries, and one thinks here of Greece, as a perfect example, have never recovered. Here too, the human toll has tended to be underreported. During this time, it was often averred that because of Africa's distance and relative disconnectedness from the American and European recession dynamics, our continent was perhaps one of the least affected and impacted by the Great Recession. And indeed, to date, informed research on the impact of the Great Recession of South Africa and Africa has been scanty. And that, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, is what makes this report so important and so timely. For too long, external voices have predominated when it comes to views, perceptions, and predictions around the impact on Africa of global events external to our continent. One finds echoes of this tendency in the copious articles on Africa Rising, to cite but one example. I would in fact love to see some research on just how accurate and insightful those articles have been. What has been conspicuously absent is the African voice articulating the African experience of events external to its locus of control. Africa must firstly assert its own voice and experience as independent thinkers and analyzers intimately connected to their own environments. Secondly, our continent and Africans must grow and develop the practice of conducting quality research that can become a national, continental, and global resource of the highest order. Research that will become global, authoritative, go-to resources for intelligent expositions of African affairs. This is where the value of MISTRA and Timali lie. Both are dedicated to growth, development, and articulation of the African experience through scholarship and leadership, amongst others. And this commitment to excellent authoritative research and engagement is reflected in the caliber and status of the authors who have contributed to this report. I think you will all be appreciative of the fact that President Mbeki himself has made a contribution to this book that we are launching tonight. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, these are commentators and scholars of the highest order and experience, all of whom bring to the report gravitas and status that will be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. The decoloniality movement has had at its heart a call for authentically African generation, rather knowledge generation and expression. This report is also a response to that call and a singular contribution to the body of knowledge on our own continent. I'm therefore delighted to open this book launch, to thank you for your seminal contributions to the report, to encourage all of us to continue with the important work that we are witnessing tonight, and to wish all of us well as we make a contribution in the endeavors of the work that will be unfolding. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that warm welcome, Professor Makhanya. We will now move on to Dr. Raj Davidian, who is the founder of Pan-African Capital Holdings. He's also a long-time friend of MISTRA. He's also a contributor to the book.
Your Excellency, President Mbeki, Vice Chancellor, I'm not going to do a Nigerian here and not mention everybody, but I cannot but acknowledge Professor Komo, my comrade in research, Mr. Jordan Teshenze, and it's so good to see some of our ambassadors and ex-ministers. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is my true pleasure and honor indeed to be standing in front of you to share some reflections, not so much on the book per se, but on the experience that we, through the research and outside the research, in whatever part of the society we have been, as a business person, as a citizen of Africa, as a student, particularly the young ones, we have experienced, knowingly or unknowingly, of the consequences of this event, which now is called the Great Recession of 2008. I'm going to share with you my reflections on it, and I've titled it The Age of Disruption and the Imperative of a Human Value System. It is fairly safe to suggest that we live in the age of disruption. Every sphere of human activity and our civilization in general is subject to disruptive forces of technology, ideas, social rebellion, and the collapse of unworkable, unjust, and unsustainable systems. It is an obvious reality that the equilibrium of the world and the stability of its subsystems of socioeconomic and political systems are shaken to the core. I submit that no amount of cosmetic change or theoretical gymnastics is likely to do any good or alleviate any of the forceful drivers of the prevailing disequilibrium. The systemic instability has resulted from two forces. One force is the cumulative, ongoing erosion of the system's underpinnings. So it's not an event, it's a process, but it keeps adding up and eroding the base. At the same time, there are occasional ruptures in some or other component of the system. The Great Recession of 2008 was one such eruption, a massive tremor that brought banks like Lehman Brothers down, that brought with it close to 15,000 other financial institutions, less known, but no less significant in terms of human and welfare costs. It also brought to an abrupt end the super cycle of growth with its massive consequences. We have not seen the end of its consequences yet. Its impact has lingered on not only in the United States, but also in Europe, UK, and the world economy in general. We in South Africa, and indeed in all the resource-rich countries and regions, have continued to feel the aftershocks even 8 years later. The intergenerational dimensions, that is, the tension between the younger generations and the older generations, the intergenerational dimensions of this financial system's rupture have resulted in socio-political discontent and the political rebellion that has just begun to reflect in the recent democratic elections from Brexit to the United States elections, in which both the Democratic and the Republican parties were found wanting. In effect, these are the cases of the groundswell of the popular rejection of the prevailing establishment. That is, the political establishment, the economic establishment, and the media establishment. Intellectually, we need to begin a genuine search for possible, realistic, and sustainable alternatives. It is a historic fact that over the past 2 centuries, a mix of scientific, technological, and social developments have made socioeconomic life far more complex, intellectually exciting, yet systemically unstable, and with rising vulnerability to sociopolitical volatility. It is equally true that in the process, our human conducts, both at the personal and collective levels, have drifted away, drifted from largely ethical, moral, and spiritual to manifestly functional, utilitarian objectives. The rapid pace of globalization has compounded the complexities and accelerated the move towards a utilitarian human and social functioning. Experts may differ as to the root causes of these developments, yet there is little disagreement that the upshot of them all is the prevailing unstable and troublesome sociopolitical system the world over. Widespread human suffering, abuse of political power, misuse of financial and economic resources, the spread of corruption, the rise of malfunctioning of public administrations, and the scarcity of inspired leadership are the common phenomenon in both developing and developed nations, in established and emerging democracies, in democratic and totalitarian states, in traditional tribal settings, and in modern unified societies, in poor as well as in the resourceful countries. In short, our current human socioeconomic system is facing a crisis of sustainability, legitimacy, and integrity. The evolution of social progress, propelled by unprecedented advancements in technology, communication, and transportation, and fostering of ideas, has systematically reduced the role of morality and ethics in various spheres of human civilization. Perspectives have shifted away from essential and long-term considerations to functional and short-term preoccupations. As such, I submit that a systemic issue has emerged which needs a systemic solution. Partial measures driven by opportunistic exigencies of world would at least or at best deal with the symptoms, leaving the root causes intact. I firmly believe that the system's fault lines is largely due to the rise of materialistic secularism in the name of modernity and the near neglect of ethics, morality, and spirituality. Now, in this context, I suggest 3 gods, 3 false gods, have emerged that are hard at work in guises and in different forms and shapes. The modern history of our contemporary social order may be characterized by the rise of the 3 false gods of individualism, materialism, and nationalism. The systemic emergence of globalization has meanwhile compounded and or conflicted with elements of these 3 false gods. Secularism over time has evolved and led to the social experimentations that continue to have widespread undesirable social, economic, and environmental consequences. The rise of secularism and its rapid transmutation into materialism has had deep systemic consequences. All modalities of social governance, be it capitalism, socialism, communism, or a blend of them, defined progress and the ultimate goals of socioeconomic development in terms of materialistic indicators of success, and only in terms of materialistic indicators. These systems of governance differed only in terms of the means of delivery. That in some cases, they relied on the machinery of the state. They didn't trust the market mechanism, so the state was the means of delivery of the same materialistic ends. In some others, it was a mixed economy. It's a blend of market and the state. In some extreme cases of libertarian form, they wanted to have minimal state and maximize the role of the markets. But they all had one thing in common. They all wanted to deliver material indicators of social development. In effect, development defined in terms of certain patterns of modernization seems to refer exactly to those processes which promote the domination of people's material ambitions over their ethical, moral, and spiritual goals. While the search of a scientific and technologically modern society is a central goal of human development, it must base its educational, economic, political, and cultural structures on the concept of the spiritual nature of human being, not only on its or her material indicators. However, the sidelining of ethics and morality in the definition of developmental objectives and the predominance of the materialistic paradigm reduce the developmental challenge to a purely materialistic enterprise. This, in turn, has led to a gradual but systemic dilution of ethical conduct over the period. In almost all countries, including South Africa, over the past while, a gradual but tangible rift has emerged between the country's socioeconomic and political, formal or professed, as opposed to informal or practiced ethics. For example, in the business sector, business executives and corporations formally subscribe to the codes of good corporate governance. Their annual glossary reports and annual reports are decorated with impressive evidences of their socially responsible citizenship. Yet, operationally, they do not hesitate to collude and/or abuse their market power. Evidences of price fixing among pharmaceutical companies, bread producers, cement manufacturers, steel manufacturers, and goes on. The construction companies are the only ones that have been fined, and relatively heavily, for their unethical, collusive conduct. The cell phone companies, the banking sector, and so it goes. That is the practice ethics. What's in the glossaries of annual reports is the professed ethics. There is a gap. The gap between the formal and informal ethics within the government sector is even more pervasive. Frequently, government ministers, departmental executives espouse global best practice. Have you heard of it? Or display a prominent poster of Botopele principles at the ministers' or offices. Yet operationally, in their organizational and managerial conduct, there is little evidence of the values and the standards or practices that conform to their formal statements. Duality of the values is equally prevalent in labor unions, the media sector, and other social structures. Most poignantly, religious organizations have not been spared the scourge of the duality of values either. So, the world over, there is an evident, however disturbing, prevalence of the systemic inconsistency of ethical conduct. This, I submit, is the bitter fruit of the promotion of materialistic enterprise over the past century. This is best captured in the modern theory of the firm. And I'm sure some of you may have taken Finance 101 or lectured in finance and financial economics. The modern theory of the firm goes along the following lines. Within the financial paradigm, and remember 2008 Great Recession was brewed, executed, erupted in the financial sector. This is the guiding principle. The firm within the theory of finance is seen as a complex network of contractual relationships, mostly implicit, not explicit contracts, between various interest groups. Within this paradigm, a rational agent, and every agent is supposed to be rational, behave rationally, is simply one who pursues personal material advantage ad infinitum. In essence, to be rational in finance is to be individualistic, materialistic, and competitive. Those are the three indicators of success, the three prerequisites of success in this paradigm. Business is a game played by individuals. As with all other games, the object is to win. And winning is measured in terms of solely of material wealth. Within the discipline, this rationality is never questioned and has indeed become the theory of the firm's sine qua non. That is what we teach, that is what we are taught, and that is what's being practiced. This is one place that there is no duality of values. It is in pursuit of this principle of rational human agents within the finance paradigm. The same paradigm is by and large replicated in the competitive democratic governance regimes. Dr. Michael Kohlberg of Maryland University, he's assessing the American system by and large, but largely applies to most, if not all, modern democratic regimes. He observes, in his assessment of Western liberal democracy, he says, the breakdown in civility, the rise of mean-spiritedness, the problem of gridlock, and the spread of political corruption. Assuming these things have indeed deteriorated over time, are not abuses or corruption of the partisan system. Such developments are the culmination, the perfection of the system. Nowadays, the political leaders, they think they perfected the art of winning democratic systems. They do not feel bad about it at all. And these are the perfections of the system that political scientists refer to as adversary democracy. Furthermore, Kohlberg argues that political competition undermines the ability of the state to correct market distortions or market failures. He maintains the reasons for this are not difficult to understand. Political competition is an expensive activity, growing more and more expensive in every generation. Successful campaigns are waged by those who have the financial support of the most affluent market actors. those who have profited the most from market mechanisms, deficiencies, and excesses. The problem is a primary cause of the growing disparity of wealth and poverty that are now witnessed throughout the world, including the Western world itself. So the issue which was once upon a time the problem of the financiers, to be individualistic, to be self-centered, to be materialistic at all costs, has permeated into other spheres of governance, most prominently into the political spheres. The prevalence of materialistic secularism has yet another critical adverse socioeconomic consequence. Complex social, economic, and environmental problems inherently require long-term planning and continued commitment. You cannot do them in 3 years, 4 years short-term, even if it's 5 years. Yet, individualistic, competitive political leaders seek short-term remedies, often at the expense of exacerbating the problem. Kohlberg argues and underscores the point that in order to gain and maintain power, political entrepreneurs must cater to the immediate interests of their constituents so that visible results can be realized within a relatively short period of time. Even when long-term political commitments are made out of principle by one candidate or one party, continuity is often disrupted or compromised by succeeding candidates or parties who dismantle or fail to enforce the program. In South Africa, we have seen a number of these examples over the past decade. We have seen some of our long-term visionary projects aborted due to precisely this political short-termism and political corruption, or lack of commitment to issues that are of long-term nature. We often talk about the legacy of apartheid, the legacy of imperialism, colonialism, but the reversal of those legacies will be foolish to think that it's short-term. We require long-term commitment and the commitment of not just political capital, but economic and financial capital and human resources. And yet, these are the type of disruptions that the democratic frequent elections, 4 years, 5 years, do not serve. And the ethics of governance and lack of inspired leadership complicates the picture more. The upshot of these developments is a simultaneous prevalence of market failures and government and political failures. It is a matter of subjective belief as to which failure is more consequential. What is not deniable is the fact that the concurrent failure of markets and governments has created an extraordinary and explosive maldistribution of income the world over. This has been further compounded by the unrelenting technological advancement leading to labor-saving outcomes, skills revolution, and job relocation. Examples of this today in the agriculture sector that once upon a time we regarded as a labor-intensive industry, many jobs are replaced by drone technology. This year, in Florida, there is a 10,000-hectare farm that has no human being in it at all. A couple of engineers in air-conditioned rooms are managing everything together with computerized, incredibly accurate, which is called precision farming systems. In the manufacturing sector, Pirelli, which is a tire manufacturer, over the past 12 years has been operating one of the most successful tire manufacturing outlets without any human beings. In Mokopane, there is a platinum mine opening soon, that instead of what would have been between 37 to 52,000 humans in different capacities working, there will be a mere 332 engineers operating the drones underground, and there will not be one single human being underground. And I can go on and on and on. This is a revolution in skills. This is a dislocation of jobs with massive social and welfare consequences. This is unrelenting. It has just begun. You have seen in other spheres of life, we seldom go to banks these days, and I don't know how many of the youngsters here have ever been to a post office. You may not know what it is, but my generation used to spend at least on average 3 to 4 hours per week either posting, leaking stamps, or opening envelopes using different technologies. You don't know about that. And I submit that yourself and definitely your children will not know mine workers, agriculture workers. And then I leave it to you to contemplate the social welfare implications. If we do not preemptively, urgently, as a matter of human and national priority, consider the full implications of this relentless technological advancement, we cannot blame others for it. And standing in front of you at an institution of higher learning, in front of Vice Chancellor, my appeal to all of us is that's where this is one of the areas where our national discourse should focus. It is up to us to understand, to digest, internalize, react. Nobody will do it for us. The socio-political response across the globe to these developments has been diverse and ongoing. These include the rise of 99% 1% movement in the United States and in the UK largely, but in 122 other countries too. The growing restlessness among the younger generations the world over, the rising intergenerational tension, the widespread suspicion of the political establishment, be they in UK, United States, China, Saudi Arabia, Japan, or South Africa. How do you trust the systems when they are busy with other things and not dealing with the real issues that affect real people now and in years to come? In brief, nearly in all spheres of human activity, the dominance of materialistic secularism has caused systemic distortions with deep social, political, and economic impact. The most fundamental of these distortions is about the concept or the conception of human nature. Underlying all these practices in the finance theory or in the political dogfights of the modern days is the assumption that human nature is essentially selfish, competitive, and exclusionary. This basic assumption needs to be challenged. The failure of materialistic secularism and its resultant systemic malaise the world over has necessitated the development and promotion of alternative approaches. Critical for such alternatives is the recognition of the spiritual nature of human beings and the recalibration of our education system, our socioeconomic system, our financial infrastructure, and very importantly, the framing of our public policy discourses. The governance paradigm is particularly in need of fundamental rethink. After all, many of the socioeconomic ills arise from the fact that governance institutions, their modus operandi, and those who populate them are out of sync with the requirements of the modern society's informed citizens and active social participants. To conclude, it is important to remember that the forefathers of modern political economy have convincingly argued that no socioeconomic system is sustainable, let alone prosperous, without a set of moral values that are generally internalized across the society. With the rise of globalization and growing diversity, the establishment and promotion of an explicit set of value system is of overwhelming significance for success in modern societies. It may be argued that given the widespread and depressing evidences of worldwide corruption, unethical conduct, and the resultant social destruction, the need for an explicit value system as the propagator of ethical conduct has never been so dire. It is my view that it is high time that we go back to the basics, both at the individual and organizational level. Our socioeconomic and political architecture needs to be redesigned from the bottom up, founded upon a selection of moral and ethical values that are in harmony with the spiritual nature of the human being. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Davidian, for those remarks. A bit depressing, but hopeful also at the same time. But what resonated with me was the focus on long-term solutions as opposed to the prevalent short-termism, which is important for us at MISTRA, because that's the impetus behind the formation of MISTRA, to focus on high-level strategic engagement with issues that is free from pressures of immediate response. So I thank you for that. And I also thank you for saving me some 10 minutes, which is good for our program. Before I forget, the millennials will kill me for this, those who do not know the post office. The hashtag for this event is Great Recession. So it's hashtag Great Recession. You can go there and post and follow the proceedings of the day. On that note, I would like to call upon Professor Vusi Gumede, who's also the project leader. He will now get us into the business of the book itself. He's going to give us an overview, and thereafter we will then call upon all the contributors to answer some questions.
Thanks, Program Director, and greetings everyone this evening. I'm going to try and give an overview, but it seems Professor Makanya has already given this overview, and Professor Davidian as well. Just to start with, to observe protocol, greetings, Patron, Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of South Africa, the senior leadership of MISTRA that is here. They're sitting in front here and spread around. And the Thabo Mbeki Foundation trustees that are here, my colleagues here at UNISA, also in the management, as well as the contributors to the project. But I'm not sure what Mr. John Chitenza is going to say when he closes. The director for MISTRA, who has played a significant role on this project. I think I must acknowledge the colleagues who played a very important role on the project, both from the MISTRA side and the Timali side. And I have to acknowledge in particular Samuel Ororontoba over there, who was a project assistant, who also contributed to the book. And of course, for contributors who've agreed and cooperated with MISTRA and myself, going back and forth as it happens with book projects. Just to expose the patron, by the way, he has a chapter in the book, as you know, and this comes from a very important paper that I hope everyone read or must read in 2010. A paper that was problematizing the global economic crisis. At that point in time, more so the global financial crisis. And I think we must thank him for that, and also contributing to the book. And of course influenced our thinking on this project, those of us who've been laboring to figure out what needs to be done with the African economy broadly, still distill from that particular paper, the 2010 paper, and I might say something more about it as I go along. And I want to make a disclaimer as I give an overview that there is a Mail and Guardian article tomorrow which summarizes the book. So I'm going to be actually distilling from it for the overview today. And in the main, I think all the contributors agree, and Prof. Davidian has spoken to this, so is Prof. Makanya too, what really precipitated the global economic crisis, which started with the food and financial crisis in 2007 or thereabout. And also contributors agree that reprieve is not near. Hence the characterization of the current global economic crisis as the Great Recession, because the crisis that we're dealing with has been deeper, more extended relative to the Great Depression of the 1930s. And one of the fundamental questions that the book, the project intended to address has to do with how to get out of the quagmire. All the contributors were asked to look into this question, particularly with the view of addressing human values, which is something that Prof. Davidian has spoken to. In addition, the question also arose in relation to, can the current inappropriate social relations be structured so that collective interests of humanity as a whole could be equitably secured? So in about 2 years, the project started just about this time. There were 2 projects going parallel, this project and the review of the 20 years of democracy in South Africa. And the manuscript for that particular project was out early in the year, the one for the 20 years of democracy, and this one took slightly longer. The team of researchers were working to address these questions and other pertinent questions. The research which has culminated into the book that we are launching today did not only deal with the origins of the crisis, but also examined impacts and implications of the recession for human values, as I've indicated, with the aim of better informing Africa's development agenda. What has happened, as many contributors in the book indicate, is that we now live in the times of the values of the market. So the human values of social solidarity, of caring, of equity, of fairness, and such noble ideals have become the things of the past. The contributors to the book agree that the recession is an inevitable consequence of an economic system that privileges the market over the state and society. Noam Chomsky actually calls this profit over people, or something like that. It is effectively immanent in the social processes of capitalist relations, as the patron wrote about this in the 2010 and also in the book, that greed and individualism plunges the world economy into a shambles from time to time. What is different this time around, it seems the damage is not comparable to the previous crisis, and the way out is not very clear, hence the importance of the project. The subservience of the state to the market has ensured that the powerful oligarchy and the global elites at the core of the global capital influence policy to favor their own class interests. And I think these are issues that Prof. Davidian has alluded to. The state had very little, and I think it continues to have very little, if any, to say, as the state has been castigated to oblivion. Africa has been the hardest hit, contrary to what many have said, and many gains have been reversed. You could think about what has happened with regards to inequality, to poverty, to well-being, and such. And the economies in Africa, contrary to the Africa Rising narrative, have not been able to return to the pre-crisis growth levels. So this notion of Africa Rising is problematized in the book by many contributors. Look at how economies in Africa were performing just before 2007 and how they're performing now. It suggests that we still have a long way to go to return to those levels before 2007 or thereabout. Although policymakers in Africa initially thought that the continent was insulated from the crisis, the manner in which Africa is integrated to global economy, or their economies are integrated to the global economy in the form of unrestrained financial exposures, unregulated commodity markets, and dependence on foreign aid have contradicted such ill-informed optimism. And of course, advice that was given to policymakers in our continent and even here at home was not taken into account. Hence, we remain with many economies in our continent doing the way they are performing or not performing well. As indicated, it was therefore fitting that a research project on the Great Recession is undertaken. The research engaged with the global economic crisis from both theoretical and policy perspectives, and how the recession affected the continent or affects the continent. Scholars from various disciplines and various locations, you'll see we've got contributors not only from South Africa, also contributors from the various disciplines. They examined the crisis from the historical, empirical, class, and geopolitical interest perspectives for distilling lessons for our continent and its growth and development. Scholars that were part of the research team agree that the crisis had its origin in the illogic of accumulation that propels capitalism and imperialism. In essence, the structure of global accumulation that subsists since the end of the Second World War has continued under various forms and guises. In the main, there have been changes in the organization of economic activities from manufacturing to financialization, from manufacturing or from production to financialization. As such, the real economy is increasingly delinked from financial markets due to globalized financialization. Despite the consensus amongst the global players that the crisis was a fallout of an economic system whose philosophy and logic are embedded in artificial assumptions of perfect information, of clearing markets and equilibrium, as Prof. Abidan was indicating, nothing drastic or substantive has been done to address the implications of the crisis. Companies and banks were bailed out as they were said to be too big to fail. Given the contradictions of the current global economy, it will appear and disappoint that the book emphasizes that Africa needs a better socio-economic system to reassert its position and enhance its resistance to the inequity and fragility of the global disorder or order we find ourselves in. Contributors propose various aspects of an alternative economic and social development approach that could rescue the world economy from terminal crisis. So if you look, for instance, at chapters by Lorenzo Friamonti, more specifically, who proposes an approach that he calls a horizontal economy. You look at other chapters, Devin Pillay and many others who suggest how to get us out of the ecological crisis, and many others who propose various aspects of a socio-economic development approach that could help, at least for the African continent, to get us back on track. In conclusion, the book supposes that there is need to explore the intersection between the experiences of developmental states and the best attributes of social democracies. And I'm paraphrasing one of the editors of the book here. You might know who that is, who feel very strong about this, that through an appropriate adaptation of the various realities to concrete conditions, in the meantime, because it may take a very long time for us to come up with this alternative socio-economic development approach, in the meantime, possibilities could be unleashed to transform economies in Africa to be more inclusive by ensuring an appropriate adaptation of the various realities to our concrete conditions. In conclusion, as I've said, lastly, the book concludes by indicating that now is the time to think differently, to challenge orthodoxies, to experiment with ideas, to take bold steps in policy development and implementation. The central message from the authors is clear, that stagnation in theory and praxis in the face of the global public crisis is not an option. And I conclude here, and I think we'll be welcoming the authors in front. Over to you, Program Director.
Thank you very much, Prof. Gumede. And now I'd like to welcome the contributors to move to the front so that we can have a bit of a Q&A. And also, for those who are interested in buying any of the books, including the one that's being launched today, the book sales are there near the entrance. There's our colleagues from REP who will be managing that process. So now I'd like to call on the project leader again to lead his team of contributors. We had,
Well, I was trying to see if the other authors that are hiding in the audience, because we had some few confirmations, but I think I don't see the people that are expected to see here. So I think those that contributed should come in front, they know themselves. I think people who contributed know themselves. They're in the book.
I think they're very shy.
Please, Patron, will you join us in front?
It seems Prof. Gumede managed to gather a team of very shy contributors. But we had allocated an hour to this session, and it is now 8:06, and I know that you all trying to get to the cocktail, which is after the session sooner. So I will try to wrap it up and maybe reduce it by 20 minutes. All right. All right then. So Vusi, I hope you don't mind if I take 4 questions at a time.
Yeah, that's fine.
And then you will respond accordingly. And please introduce yourself and if you could mention your affiliation.
Good evening. My name is Simo Zulu. I'm a student at Timali. I'm directing this question to, I know that the patron is contributed, so I would like to also ask this question to him. or Professor Gumede to respond. The impact of the global financial crisis, you mentioned that different regions across the world responded differently. And I would like us to focus particularly on South Africa, that as the impact of the financial crisis was being felt, the government and the whole of society and different sectors of society were discussing and coming up with the National Development Plan. And I would also add that what the patron had said a few days ago was the absence of an implementation plan of that NDP. Do you think that the NDP is a requisite response to the impact of the financial crisis, and can it be able to lift society, and particularly South African society, to ensure that there is a better life for all of our people? Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks. My name is David from Mapungubwe Institute. The first question is, to the extent that, or probably is a suggestion, to the extent that the crisis did not originate in Africa, then I do not think that it qualifies fully to be called a global economic crisis. That's the first part. The second part is that, however, because the implications affect us in this continent as a region, in that way, we are part of the crisis. And that explains the integrative manner of globalization on the one hand and its ability to marginalize on the other. The question I have is, why is it that there has been this crisis and yet across the world people have not risen up against the status quo? And at the same time, the so-called left parties across the world are in retreat. Does that mean that we do not have an alternative to the status quo? Thanks.
Thank you very much. It's Hendrik Cronje from the Africa Leadership Development Institute, struggling with the same issues of what kind of leadership we need on our continent to make a difference as such. And whilst listening to the input as such, it's also clear, like elsewhere, we need political revolutions, we need economic revolutions, we need social revolutions, and we certainly need different value-based, as indicated as such. But with the challenges that's emerging, slow economic growth and more descent around the political thing, the fourth industrial revolution, jobless growth and even destroying jobs in certain ways, and the great difficulty of social revolutions as such. How are we going to get out of this? What's it?
Good evening. My name is Mulekwane. I'm from TUT. My name is Mulekwane. I'm from TUT. Also a student here in UNISA. I've been listening to the presenters here. My main worry is this. I characterize this as the tyranny of orthodoxies and frameworks. You know, you find the so-called Western experts, they use rigid orthodoxies and frameworks. And if you don't fall within those frameworks, you are castigated as though, you are castigated. But however, what worries me more is that our pundits in South Africa seem to be replicating the same tendencies, which unfortunately leads to privileging of certain ideas over other ideas, leading to other ideas which are considered not to be mainstream, to be frozen in time, and also leading to sterility in intellectual discourse, such that, for me, intellectuals must be subversive. We need to be subversive in intellectual discourse, because we need to shake off these established tendencies, because they are fossilizing people. I mean, for example, in South Africa, we, the so-called masses, we are assumed not to have ideas. Certain people have ideas, and then I'm just wondering what Dr. Raj has stated that, in your discourse, you were suggesting that the problems are so complex, they are multivariate. But however, still, our pundits, they have this proclivity of, sidelining other people,
Thank you very much. And now I will allow the contributors to respond to those. I know some or one or two questions were directed at the former president. He will make some remarks at the end, so lucky you. Just a few remarks, but we will continue.
Yeah, I'm wondering if our keynote speech should start. I think it might be useful. Will you start? Could you start? Yeah.
On Mr. Zulu's question of is NDP appropriate response to the problem in hand? I think NDP at best is a medium to long-term roadmap. It does not tell us what we need to do tomorrow. And very importantly, and I think President Mbeki also in his speech, I think Saturday was highlighting the fact that any plan without programs of implementation is as good as the papers written on. Student of economic history would know that India made a name for having 5-year plans in 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, right? 3 decades of 5-year plans. Not a single one of those plans were implemented. And yet governments were pretentious enough, misleading enough to come and launch the next 5-year plan. They haven't opened the first 5-year plan, they're launching the second. And it went for 3 decades. As a student of economics, we were sitting in the lecture hall and the professor was saying, oh, so what's wrong with these people? But they said, that's India for you. That's not an answer. We cannot have a situation where another NDP version 2 comes and then somebody asks in a lecture hall, what's wrong with them? Well, this is South Africa for you. We can't get there. This is a betrayal of the notion of leadership. This is a betrayal of economic planning. This is a betrayal of a response to a crisis. This is not a response to the crisis. If we wanted to have a plan, we would have, for example, Chapter 1 that deals with a capable state. It would say, well, capable state is an indispensable requirement of this roadmap. From next Monday, this is what will happen. The president will not appoint somebody to any position without ABC and specify it. The minister would not do that. DG would have certain requirements. Teachers would have certain requirements. City managers, and I can go on and on and on. So we need to separate a vision, a roadmap, from a programmatic, time-bound, detailed response to a crisis. So in that respect, NDP was no mere than a political exercise. It has remained a political exercise. The very fact that the 9-point plan of the State of the Nation's president's response 2 years ago had no resemblance, no root in NDP, tells you all. And we haven't got time for me. I can see if you open that chapter in my heart, we'll be here the whole night. So I think this is where the intellectuals, where the universities, where all of us as citizens have a responsibility to act. We can't just sit and analyze. That analysis should be left to those who write books. Because lack of action in these things, in these social realities, costs us. Cost our children, cost your future, and so it goes. It is not academic. It's a very real issue.
Thank you very much. I just want to respond to David's question about whether people did not react to the global economic crisis. People reacted. We had various Occupy movements in New York, in South Africa, in different parts of the world. No part of the world was insulated from the crisis. Some of the policymakers in Africa initially said we are insulated, but like you said, the global economy is so integrated that no part of the world can be insulated. We had response or reactions to the crisis, and there are alternatives, but I will quote the former president again, that what he wrote in a thinkers about last year, I think, when he said, what we need are progressive leaders. We need progressive thinkers and doers, especially in Africa. we need national developmental elites, not predatory elites, that can craft out development plans and have the capacity to implement these plans. So because, as we have seen increasingly, the current system is not sustainable, and that's why we have the rise of populist governments now in Europe and in America. And we need, from example of China, we see that you may not necessarily follow the neoliberal model of development. We have example from the Asian countries that didn't follow that and they develop. So the action point is for us to organize rather than agonize. Thank you.
I think our keynote speaker is going to take some additional questions. He wrote quite a lot of them, I think. I only have 2. I don't know how he has so many. Please, Prof.
Mr. Cornier's, Amara, Mr. Cornier, question of, if I understood you saying in low GDP or no GDP growth, where are we going to get the resources to deal with economic revolution, political revolution, and financial revolutions? I think that one of the realities of history is that in good times, people are lulled to believe that things are okay. The super cycle of growth meant that many countries were doing fine. There isn't anything to change. So they weren't actually doing things because things were good. Because the pensioners were getting 20% more welfare, they said, well, it's good, we're better off. The workers were employed, the capitalists making money, and politicians were comforted by the fact that there isn't much upheaval. The problems were still there. The problems that we have today, they were existing at that time. These are systemic problems. So I don't think we should use low economic cycle, high economic cycle as an excuse to procrastinate dealing with systemic issues. In good times, we have more resources to do it. In bad times, we have more urge and social imperative to do it. Because what's the cost of not taking the right decisions now? We can rest assured that in 5 years' time, our pensioners will have, in real terms, half the money that they're getting today. With the best of political leadership. There won't be resources. We've already seen that there is over the past 2 years, effective pension payments has gone down by 11%. By that, I mean if you adjust it for inflation. Another 2 years, the compound effect will take it to 35%. The year after, 50%. So we don't have to wait until the train smash happens. We can see it happening now. Unemployment, the same. Right? So what are we waiting for? We have no choice. If we want to deal with these issues, neither good times nor bad times should be an excuse for an intelligence response to a social reality. My advice or my humble opinion is every time is the right time to do the right thing. Right? And if it's bad time, even more so. I've got a boss here who's driving me. Mike, is that Malekwane? Did I understand you correct? If I understood your question of do we intellectually sidelining some paradigms of thinking? Is that what, did I understand it correctly? I don't think anybody has got monopoly over solutions or monopoly over intellectual thinking. So the fact that we use certain terminologies does not mean that on the ground, a participatory consultation by people who are affected will not find actual solutions for much of the problems that they have. In fact, at times, if you intellectualize it too much, you lose the substance of some of the solutions. Let me give you a couple of examples. If we go today to some of our villages, there are business people, there are unemployed people, there are, and by the way, this is not theoretical. I had in my other life, I moonlight as an economist. My day job is doing businesses on the ground. In Limpopo, 5 years ago, this side of the river, there are farmers who are very prosperous. literally that side of the farm, that side of the river. There are a few communities there, unemployment 65%, communal land, right? You can imagine the level of poverty, a few of them working this side of the river for the commercial farmers. Now, if you leave it to an academic thinker who would want to talk about communism, capitalism, the tyrannies of this and that, you bring the people around the table and they say, look, guys, we have a problem. You have the land, you have the human resources, this side of the river, they've got the capital, they've got the know-how, can we put it together to do something? And how long do you think you took for the chief, for the unemployed, and for the people to find the solution? Without any of these jargons. 3.5 hours. And today I can take you there. There are 5,800 full-time workers, 523 commercial farmers from the same community. And I would suggest that from where I'm sitting, the risk to doing business in that environment has 90% gone. Because everybody just about has got interest in doing the right thing in that area. It's not just white farmers who are racist or who are rich on this side of the river. To me, that's an example of how we should solve our problems on the ground. There are issues on the ground that requires participatory consultative processes to draw on the insight and intelligence of everybody. Then there are systemic issues that we need to deal with them separately. For example, the issues of intra-Africa trade and investment, intra-Africa logistical shortcomings, or infrastructure shortcomings. That you cannot do it through that mechanism. Then you need a different inspired thinking at a different level. But these two are complementary. When you do more of that integration, more opportunities arise for local development, empowerment, and participation. 5 years, 10 years later, these two converge. You have a different social, political, and economic landscape.
Well, just very quickly on the issue of the response by South Africa. I mean, this, like, just as a matter of historical memory or such, Simo, that between 2008, well, from about 2007, there was a committee in government here in South Africa that was basically looking at how South Africa should respond to the global economic crisis. At that point in time, the focus was on the global financial and the food crisis, and that culminated in something. It went to NETLEC. There were discussions about that, but it seems there was no follow-through. So I think some of the things that were being undertaken around 2007, 08, 09, kind of were not taken forward. And this is probably one of the challenges. I mean, I write about this in a 2011 paper, how South Africa was responding to the global economic crisis at that point in time and getting advice. But I think that there was no follow-through. So even before the NDP, there were some processes to address, at least to be more specific about how should South Africa respond to the crisis. And I think that information may be useful. Briefly, David, I think there are alternatives. And of course, I think many people are working through this. And some of us think that it may very well be that we need to revisit proposals that have been made before. So if you look at the works of Samir Amin, Claudia Ake, Thandi Mkandawire, and many others who had problematized the earlier economic crisis and made proposals about what should be done about that, some of us believe that we need to relook at those proposals because they were very specific to the context of the continent and how could the continent deal with the crisis, the economic crisis, in an ongoing basis than the ones of. Thanks.
Thank you very much. For the next round, I've noted 3 hands, 4. Okay, and I think this is I will take the 5 because now we don't have enough time. I said I'm cutting the program down to 8:40, we've got 10 minutes. And please make it short. We've got the green jersey at the back, and I've noted the 3 hands here, and then there's the red, and that's it.
Thank you very much. I'm Nevari. I'm nobody. I'm just a citizen of this country. I just want to get more concrete, response, because my observation is that in the minds of many, and I know my friend also wanted to advocate that part, that because this seems to be the failure of capitalism, it therefore means that it's a time for socialism to rise. Is the solution could be found in between the two or in the middle? I'm saying this because if you are to look at the trend, there seems to be a greater confusion on what becomes the solution of the current challenges. And no one seems to get the clarity with regard to what needs to be done exactly. There's just an element of analysis, but the clear concrete path is not found. But I just do a book review and go to one chapter. And my suspicion is that the former president is advocating for socialism. And I want him to come clear if that is his position, that we must move towards socialism.
Okay.
Can I go ahead? Thank you very much. My question is, my name is Jacques Ngembo Kalambika, former student at Timali, studied good governance. I'm the CEO and founder of African Translate Media Awareness. At our organization, we are engaged in promoting social education in Africa. My question is directed to Dr. Raj Davidian. I heard you spoke earlier on, which by the way, I think it made more sense, because I wrote a couple of days ago on our publications on Facebook, I wrote about the African integration. And from my perspective, I think to have the Africa that we want, we need our people within the continent to be integrated. And then by saying that, we don't know each other, especially as the young people. When moving around the continent, it's actually hard because of a visa requirement and so on. Another thing is xenophobic mentality of amongst the African people. I think that's another issue that I would want you to elaborate on. And then I want to know from your perspective and understanding, given the fourth industrial revolution and the disruption within education and the technological advancement, what can we do in order for us to fasten the process of integration on the continent? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Kandi. I have 2 quick questions. One for Dr. Davidian. I agree with you that our solutions should be more long-term. These quick wins are a problem. But what do we mean by the long-term? Is it the term of a president? Is it of a CEO or a generation? What do we mean by long-term? And then, of course, to Prof. I wanted to also ask you, you write very well about the idea of being connected. People keep saying this recession was American, it came from them, but didn't we have local savings, African savings, that were going to feed those assets that turned out to be toxic? So that actually, would we actually just isolate it to them, or is it actually all ours?
My name is Ben Ntlatleng. I'm a student nurse at SG Lawrence Nursing College. I'm here on my own capacity. I've heard the professor, Dr. Raj, talking about the problems that led to recession, or that could have led to recession. Among the problems he mentioned was problems concerning ethics, and then he also mentioned corruption. As a student nurse, I've observed something. In South Africa currently, where we do not, or we can't afford medical health, or healthcare. We can't afford healthcare. And then there's also a proposed NHI, which is like starting to run now. And I don't even think that we're also going to afford healthcare with it. In primary healthcare, we were taught that we have limited resources. And there's no promise that we'll have resources that will be able to cover everybody. So now, we are running, or we are in a country, or we are in a system where the system is being run like a business, as Dr. Iraj has said. So now, if we are running a system like that one, and then now we have people who need healthcare, like basic services, like housing and what, and then we cannot meet those services. Did you, in your research, maybe try to check if we can change the system that we are running, the economic system? Like as Africans, the system that was in Africa previously, I don't think it was a system that is in America, like a capitalist system. Did you maybe in your research also try to check all the African countries or the African kingdoms, how they were run, and also try to see if we can make our own system, our own African system? Will it work or not? And then last thing, I've heard the research is also, or the book is also mentioning countries like China and America a lot. I did not hear a lot about African countries. So I think that we need an African solution now. Because now, even our South African economy, when you look at it, the way Dr. Iraj said, he said that we have short-term plans, like five-year plan. That 5-year plan must be implemented by one president. If that president is not re-elected, it means that the plan just vanishes into thin air. Who came with that idea that as Africans we must have somebody who will lead us for 5 years only?
Thank you very much for that. The last question. Please make it.
Hi, my name is Sivuyile. I work for SALGA, South African Local Government Association. I'm also here though in my personal capacity. I just want to, in 2007, I know I was a little bit younger than I am now, but I recall very well that the reports out there were that South Africa was shielded from the traumatic, implications of a recession. And that was based because of our good policies that we had in place. I know that the National Credit Act had just been passed just prior to the recession. So therefore the effects were minimized. I know a couple of people lost jobs. I know a friend of mine's wife that lost a job that time, but it wasn't that aggressive. Don't we think that what we're facing is actually post implications of the recession, which could be due to the fact of maybe it could be what you just mentioned, the failure of markets, and in fact even the failure of governance. Maybe we're not doing as much as we were doing prior, the years 1994 up to 2007. I think we have dropped the ball somewhere, and therefore now that the global financial crisis continues and we remain very vulnerable as a society, that we need not to say we find ourselves in this situation because of the Great Recession. For me, personally looking, life was much better that time, 2007, 2008. There were jobs, I was job hopping everywhere. Every month I could move to a new company, and life was just good. But I know for others it wasn't. We still had what President called the first economy, the second economy. Some people were just not as privileged. But I think the situation now, it's so worse. Look at the rent, you look at the fuel price, you look at the, what you call the inflation, you look at the food prices, things are just worse. And is it because of poor governance? Is it the markets? And the last question, you speak about, the book says lessons for Africa. What is that one lesson? Maybe you can just give it for free to us. Maybe those who can afford the book, so that when we go home, at least we can say we took one lesson.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I'll hand over to the authors.
I think there are a lot of questions for Prof. Davidian, but I think Femi had some questions. Maybe let's start with you. Thanks.
Thank you very much. If I got you right, my friend, you're saying whether we couldn't have survey to pick whether the crisis will affect Africa, right? Is that what you said? No, it's not their crisis. It started from them, but what we should also understand is the peripheral position of Africa in the global economy. We are rule takers. We are not rule setters. And to that extent, we operate an economy that is not sustainable. We operate an economy that is dependent on the rules that have been set by the global powers. We should not underestimate the importance of the global power in the running of African economies. I take an example, the issue of capital account liberalization. The World Bank and the IMF, for many years, they told us that we need to liberalize our account so that we can draw foreign direct investment, which we did, and remove every form of obstacles to this, withdrawal of portfolio funds. And that was the starting point of the crisis. That the crisis that happened in US, in Europe, as soon as we don't have any restriction to the removal of funds, people withdrew their money, and there's no way we are not going to be affected. So we're affected because also the World Bank will tell us that we are not integrated enough, that Africa will be integrated, but we are saying that we are over-integrated to the global economy. So what we should do is to look for how we integrate ourselves, among ourselves, as somebody raised there, and that has to be with understanding who we are as a people. We continue to maintain the colonial boundaries and the separation that separate us. We don't understand who we are. Like he said, if we integrate our economy, build more infrastructure, integrate our market, integrate our culture, I think that to me is an alternative arrangement to dependent on the global economic structure. Where we continue to look for foreign direct investment, there are local investment that can be mobilized to create jobs for us in Africa. Thanks.
I think on your question, unfortunately, I didn't get all the names. I just put number 1, number 2. I know number 1 was for President Mbeki. We leave that to his concluding remarks. But on the subject of African xenophobia issues, young people, what we should do, I've had the privilege of traveling East, West Africa on business. And I'm absolutely shocked that wherever I go, they know more about other places than Africa. South Africa is a good example of it. I mean, fellow South Africans, when they go to Accra, they're actually lost. They still talk about London and this and that, but they know very little about, and I'm not saying I know, but when I listen to the conversation, it's quite clear that economic integration, social integration, and let's call it human integration. And it's not, we cannot blame any section. The reality of history of Africa is, even as we sit here, there are got at least 5 zones of Anglo, Francophone, Arab, Germanic, Portuguese. Language is a barrier. Even the younger generations. One would expect, for example, universities, with respect to Vice Chancellor sitting here. We try to set up a virtual graduate school of business between East, West, and Southern Africa. Why? Because if MBA students coming out, that's the best starting point, because most of these MBA students are the next chief executive or managing director of something, and the more they know about each other, the more they do business with each other. They bounce off ideas. They want a reference group. They draw on somebody who's sitting in Kenya as opposed to somebody who's sitting in France. Or somebody in Kenya wants, they're going to Germany, but they don't come to, to Pretoria. And that's, try to establish that. There's all kinds of phobias. And it's only 3 countries, in fact 4. We got Tanzania involved too. But it's difficult. Where it's not, and we have to start. We've got to make a start, and in my view, it's the younger generations that have to lead it. We now have got the technology, we've got the platform. Unfortunately, and it's really tragic, that the political leadership on the continent has regressed. And I'm saying this not because President Mbeki is sitting here, but if we do it scientifically, there was a time that in mid-90s, there was a political move led by credible political players on the continent who were at a political level having a dialogue, setting goals. But what happened to African Renaissance? What happened to Nepal? What happened to a whole African discourse? I'm asking you. I'm not criticizing you. I'm asking you. You are the ones who got to lead it. You got to generate it. So we can lament, we can argue, but unless we do it, it won't happen. And my boss is saying, move on. How long is long term? Depending on the issue. For example, if we want to deal with the education crisis of our country, 5 years, 10 years will not be enough. Because we will need something between 5 to 7 years to generate a qualified cadre of teachers, to change the management of our schools, to get politically attuned with the fact that this is not a 10-year project. That will require maybe 2 decades. And it doesn't matter who is the president and who is not. This is a national issue. This is not an ideological issue. On the healthcare, we need 3 years. So my long term is, on that is 3 years. Give all these clinics, and I want to link it to the issue of we haven't got money with our healthcare and so on. I hope you know that South Africa per capita spends the highest amount on health and on education. And I don't know how many of you have been to public hospitals and clinics, but I've had the privilege of 8 out of 9 provinces. I have physically walked through it as part of a book that I was writing in 1998. And I can tell you, you don't have to be a doctor. I trust you that if you've been given authority within 48 hours, you make 50% improvement in the operations of that clinic. And I'm asking the question, is it a question of money or is it more than that? We are spending per capita more on education, per capita more on public health, and I'm not talking about private health, and we are rated at the bottom. And I don't care who rates that, I ask you to go and visit the public clinic and public hospital and say, is that how you would keep your house? If not, then something is wrong. We don't need an expert from Washington to come and tell us. Walk to our clinics, right? Go to the washrooms. Look at the passages. Look at how sisters and brothers are being treated. These are not colonial forces. These are our sisters and brothers getting paid by you and I, but treating the public patients in a different way. Why? Why do we have teachers going to school instead of teaching and role modeling, do these horrific acts of inhuman things? That's what I was referring to, ethics. That's the ethics. So we need to become serious about this. These are issues of politics of impact on social issues. I can write books about it. Professor Gumode will write another, but my granny will die in that hospital again. And my child will be infected out of the clinic instead of being cured. It's not a question of money, my friend. We don't have to become system analysts to know that how a clinic should work. And I have the privilege over the past 8 years of sitting as an advisory board of the Auditor General's office under 3 different Auditor Generals. Every year, as recent as last year, and please go on the website of the Auditor General, 85 billion rand unaccounted for and wasted. And I'm not talking about corruption. That's a separate order of magnitude, a different bucket of money. I'm talking about budget that was given to a clinic, to a department, to a hospital. I'm talking about a 23 million budget that was spent, supposed to be 11 months later, a clinic, and you go back and you see the foundation is up, 23 million is gone, and nobody is around. You have a police station the other day in the newspapers, has become the haven of the criminals because they didn't finish it. They've spent the 72 million rand, and I can go on and on and on. So let's not talk about as if money is the shortage. Only when we deal with these efficiencies, and on the budget of a 1 trillion South African government budget, there is at the moment, if you had political clean leadership, you could tomorrow, and I'm prepared to put everything that I have if they give me political backing, to extract 15% efficiency from the current budget, even when the economy is growing at 0 growth. I won't tax anybody anymore. So that's the type of conversation. These are ethical issues. I can get very angry, sorry. Yeah.
I had to allow
because
you.
these are real issue. People die because of these practices. Children come to school, go home, at the end unemployable because somebody didn't use the tax money for the right thing. The last question. Was that Sibongile saying, how do we shield South Africa from global crisis? Let me give you this. This is how poor and misguided political leadership misses the opportunity. In 2008 and up till today, there is a global phenomenon called quantitative easing. Have you heard of that? That means Federal Reserve, United States, Central Bank, European Central Bank, Japanese, UK, they are printing money on a daily basis, 32 billion of it every month. At what cost? Zero. Picture yourself in August of 2008 when the Great Recession happened. Banks and financial institutions lend you money for 10 years at 0 rate. And you have a backlog in the country. What would you do? Right? You're a rated country. You're an investment grade country. South Africa was. And there is a global crisis. We feel sorry for the consequences, but we have an opportunity. That was the golden opportunity for us to go and borrow for a 10-year, 15-year at the lowest possible rate. And let me tell you this. Even now as we sit here, institutional investors in Europe and United States, and in terms of the latest estimates of global, McKinsey Global Institute, the estimates are about $245 trillion, US dollars, not Zimbabwean dollars, that is available. And guess at what interest rate they're managing these funds? Minus 0.5%. In other words, the investors saying, I'm prepared to give it to a credible project as long as I get my money back. What should we do? Shouldn't we go and borrow and build the infrastructure that we need, but not abuse it? That is where misguided political leadership comes. If today's South African government borrows, what do you think will come to the mind of the lender? The money will go to Saxonwold. That you don't want. That is the type of brand that we need to get rid of. Because if you profile yourself that way, nobody will and nobody should feel sorry for you. Right? But the fact is, technically we can do it. And by we, I don't mean South Africa, only Africa. We're talking about shortage of infrastructure. If we put today projects that are credible projects, that are well conceptualized, well costed, and economically make sense, you can get the funding for it at the lowest possible cost thanks to this great recession. And it will be for the next few years. The point I'm making this. In the crisis, we have a choice. We can either feel sorry for ourselves and write books about it, or if you have inspired leadership, you say this is an opportunity to deal with some of our backlogs. We snoozed through that opportunity from 2008 up until today. What do we do instead? Instead of conceptualizing the new project, we chase the Minister of Finance. We do shenanigans in our source. We discredit our institutions of credibility. Now you're talking about South Africa, let's go another country, the same type of leadership happens. Right? On the east of the continent, on the west of the continent. The political leadership's preoccupation has become on their self-enrichment, not on the real issues of health, education, backlog, integration, and building the long-term path to prosperity.
I just want to remind Prof. Abedan that there's a ship in Saxonwold. Yeah, I think, let me just indicate that there is a case study on South Africa in the book. Charlotte Dutoit has done a much more specific analysis of the South African case and also touching on the Nigerian case. And I think these other issues that have been raised about, capitalism versus socialism, African solutions, are actually covered in the book. And I think maybe others will touch on them. And I must do a little bit of advertising here. These are the issues that Timali is preoccupied with. So we do have projects that are actually looking at the African society before colonialism. And that may be something that could interest the question around what an economic system existed before what has been described as capitalism. Lastly, Program Director, I think maybe Mr. Nchitanze would make this point about the one lesson. Let me disclose this secret that was open amongst us who were working on the book, that at some point we felt that John Nchitanze should have been the co-editor of the book, but I think he felt his name shouldn't be there. So I think he would be better suited actually to give this one lesson when he concludes, but I do think it's an opportunity for Patron. There were a few specific questions. I'm not sure. He's shaking his head. I'm going to hand over to Tololo. I think Tololo might handle that better.
I think on that note, just to conclude this session, we'll bring the microphone, or would you like to come here? All right, thank you very much.
No, Joel Nchitanze had said I must speak last. In the event that these three don't answer the questions that you put to them. They have answered the questions. So I don't have anything more to say except to say buy the book. When this Great Recession started, when the financial collapse started in the US, our finance minister was Trevor Manuel. So I said to him, Trevor then was serving on the G20. At that time, the G20 was only at ministerial level. So he was a member of the G20 with other 19 finance ministers. So I said to him, no, Trevor, you see what's happened? This major financial crisis which starts in the United States, what it is saying is that the capitalist system is not functioning. It's not working. That's why this crisis and therefore this collapse that is coming, which is going to be more than financial, it's going to be a general economic crisis. So I said to him, you see, we've been, all of us, having to confront this, what was called the Washington Consensus, which had its own prescriptions. Minimize the role of the state, maximize the role of the market, deregulate, privatize, all of that. And here is the result of all of that, is this major crisis. Does this not give us an opportunity to intervene, to say there has to be a different way in which you allow your economic system to function? Because if we allow it to function as it has, it produces its outcome. Destroys jobs, destroys value, does all sorts of destructive things. Why don't we use this opportunity? Because nobody is going to say now we are communists. Because all we need to say, look at what is happening. So let's think of a way of changing this thing. So Trevor agreed. And I said to him, well, I'm happy that I will not be in your boots, because if you think this thing through properly and have to present it at the G20, you're going to be in great trouble. Because all the 19 will oppose you. But it gives us an opportunity. Well, I'm only saying that to say that was why I then wrote this paper that Vusi spoke about, 2009, 2010, really to examine this. The functioning of the capitalist system as it was then, to understand better how does this system function? How come it produces this kind of result that it had produced, negative, including all of these things that Raj is talking about, on the value systems, the ethics. How does it come about that other people, even big capitalists have written about this, that the values of the market, which are about money and making more money, how do those get translated into the functioning of society? So that a measure of success for me as an individual becomes how much money do I have in my pocket? In terms of organization of society, how do you transform communal relations into contracts among people? So I can no longer go to my uncle's house and so on and have a cup of tea and say, look, uncle, please help me, let us go and plow the garden. No, there must be a contractual relationship between us to attach money to all of these social values, until you get to the point that Raj was mentioning, that you then run a society which is not based on any ethical basis of any kind. And it can't work. And surely, as human beings, we can't accept it. Now, so I'm saying that I think, the reason I'm saying, please buy the book, is because it tries to discuss these questions. It tries to discuss these questions. You'll see at the back of the book, the last sentence says this. Running like a golden thread through all of the inputs is that the state has a critical role to play in reconfiguring social relations, proceeding from the perspective that markets, left to their own devices, wreak havoc on the commons. And above all, social relations should be premised on humane values. So I'm saying running through this thread, therefore obviously is a question of the relationship between the state and capital. There's a colleague of ours who says socialism. I wish we had given him a chance to write about that, because I'm very interested in this. Because there's a history. There's a history to the issue of socialism. Not slogans. Not slogans. I'm talking about socialism as a scientific system. You have a whole Soviet Union which gets established to implement a socialist system. Many other countries in Europe, same, and they collapse. Why? There must be a reason why that happened. I can come and speak on that tomorrow. But there's a reason why it happened. So when you come and say today, after the Soviet Union has collapsed, let's talk socialism, I would say to you, before we do that, talk to me about why it collapsed in the Soviet Union. What are the lessons that I need to draw from there? So that then indeed when I address the challenge of socialism, it's on the basis of this historical experience which exists. Or say, the Communist Party of China speaks about socialism with Chinese characters. What does that mean? I don't know if there's socialism with Zulu characters. But the question, they raise this point, we've got to understand it. I'm saying socialism not as a slogan, so that people applaud you're a socialist. But actually to talk about, you are trying to transform the society so that it serves the interests of these people in the ethical manner that Raj was talking about. And that's a very serious thing to do. And you're not going to achieve socialism by shouting slogans, but by constructing a society on the basis of some firm scientific base. In the end, what I'm saying, I think we should read all of this book, because this challenge faces us here. Yesterday, day before yesterday, I was asked to talk to the top 100 companies, this award thing which Sunday Times does a year, granting awards to this. So I went there. So one of the questions I was raising with them is, from reports I saw last year, I don't know, I haven't looked at this matter this year. The private corporations here are keeping huge volumes of liquid cash in the banks. And they gave figures in the asset managers, huge. Which means you're not investing in the South African economy. So the question arises, why? But we are running a capitalist society. These are the owners of capital, and they take a decision, for whatever reason, they take a decision that no, today, rather than open a factory or finance Iraj's projects in Limpopo of small farmers and so on, no, rather than do all of those things, let's leave the money in the banks. That's functioning of the capitalist system. So, I'm saying, but with levels of unemployment in the country, can we afford not to invest in the South African economy? In all of those sorts of questions. And they may very well have very good reasons. And I think they do, why they are not investing in the South African economy. But I'm saying it then raises a question for us as South Africans. Why do we allow that capitalism as it functions in this country produces those kinds of outcomes? When in principle you need huge investments in the economy to address unemployment, the investment capital that's available is stuck in a bank. Read the book. It addresses these questions and perhaps helps us to take all of these necessary steps that Trevor Manuel should have taken in 2008 to say, what is it that we do about even this question, about defining the role, the relationship between state and capital, so that we produce this kind of society that we need, and avoid a relationship between the state and capital, which is then described today's terms as state capture. That we don't want. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. We know that was an ambush, but I think everyone in this room is very happy with those closing remarks. And now I'd like to call upon the Executive Director of MISTRA to close the session.
Thank you, Program Director. Mine is just to say thank you, first and foremost, to the authors who helped us to put together a book that we hope will enjoy pride of place, not only in libraries and private bookshelves. As we all know, one of the core demands of the hashtag Fees Must Fall movement is a yearning for decolonized progressive content. And in MISTRA's modest view, we think this book does meet that standard. And so hopefully it will form part of prescribed work in our universities. And we believe this is critical, although I should reassure the Vice-Chancellor and Professor Vilumkome and the other staff members present that even if they don't do it, we won't organize a demonstration. I think from the evening's discussion, there is agreement that humanity is facing what the authors refer to as a poly-crisis. It straddles economics, politics, environmental, security, and other issues. But if there is a tragedy of the current period, in my view, it is that it is precisely at this moment that world leadership seems to be deficient. And South Africa is no exception in that regard. Overall, we cannot avoid asking the question about the role of finance capital, but also, I suppose, whether production relations under this capitalist system are constricting the advancement of humanity as such. And to paraphrase the old classic theorists, if the integument has to burst asunder, what beast will creep out of this mess? The book only dips a toe into this complex debate, and a health warning, I think, is necessary. The fact of having a Mbeki, a Gumede, a Patrick Bond, a Devon Pillay on one platform in one book does not mean that miraculously all the schools of thought have converged. It does not mean that we have a 2016 class project. Rather, the aim is to encourage debate. But lastly, to say again, thank you to President Thabo Mbeki for gracing the occasion, to Raj for the presentation, as well as all the authors, those who were here today, and others who could not join us. I know Vusi will be angry if I don't say this, particularly Professor Vusi Gumede and Oruntuba, who assisted with the editing of the book. Our appreciation also to you, the participants who have ensured that we have a lively discussion. What we'll also appreciate is a continuing discussion and critique of the book, and you can use any platform from the print media to social media and so on. We also wish to thank Vice-Chancellor Professor Makanya for hosting us, along with Professor Vilumkomo and other MISTRA board members who may be present. The same goes to our program director, to the staff of MISTRA, and the Thabo Mbeki Foundation for the excellent organization. Of course, we cannot forget the funders of both organizations, whom we are critiquing today, for ensuring that we have this platform for that critique. We would also want to thank the caterers for what we are about to receive. So thank you and take care.